So let me just give you some background about why I'm here and how I came to this event. Well, let me back up a second. Let me actually start off with a couple of quotes. My mom always liked quotes, and I thought about these two as a way to kick off tonight. The first one kind of really reflects my belief that we need to upgrade how we're thinking in society about how our companies work and nonprofits and governments decides to solve some of the problems and find some of the opportunities that are out there. And in many ways, I think about new impact in the work we're doing as both a fulcrum and a lever. And secondarily, I want to emphasize this concept of what we're talking about tonight is really about the how of the problem solving, not the what. And I think it's really important that we think as a society about the systems and tools that we use to actually advance where we're going. So some background on how I got here tonight. Kathy and I actually met a couple of years ago. I was asked to keynote at a conference for business school deans, which was held at Rutgers in Newark. And we'd been working in Newark, New Jersey with a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I was talking to the deans about ways to think differently about how to assemble business models for the private sector. That led to a keynote, I guess it's about a year and a half ago at Case Western in Cleveland for the UN Prime Conference, which was really thinking about how to bring the UN Sustainable Development Goals to fruition. That led to a keynote last fall, just a year ago now, at Cleveland Rising, where an amazing group of Northeast Ohioans came together in Cleveland to talk about the future of the city and the region. Out of that summit, there was a team of 4 dedicated volunteers and a larger team that actually got really enthusiastic about this whole tri-sector approach. And we launched a catalyst project for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which we'll touch on a little bit later in this. And now I'm delighted that Kent State is launching a course in tri-sector innovation, which will be commencing in January, which will also be a consulting course, and that we hope will be working with both regional and global organizations in creating more catalyst projects. So that's some background about why I'm here. I've been working now in Northeast Ohio for about a year and a half, and I've heard a lot of things. I've heard a lot about the great things about Ohio, and I have to say I've really noticed a real can-do spirit and enthusiasm. I've also heard a lot of conversation about things that aren't going so well that could be going better. And since the launch, obviously, we can't talk about Ohio without talking about COVID. And I wanted to share that since COVID hit, we have been busier than ever at New Impact. And our basic premise of using the best of society's resources between governments, companies, nonprofits has just become more and more obvious to everyone with what we're facing overall. And I like to think that these challenges we're facing between public health and economic challenges and also inequities can actually be solved potentially more quickly if organizations of all types adopt a tri-sector approach, which I'll be talking about tonight. I'm also happy to be here because we love working with universities, and we're excited to be adding Kent State to the list of universities who we've worked with. We really think universities are fundamental to not only researching this type of work and having it be spread much more broadly, but teaching it and offering courses not only in the business school, but other schools as well to really get a much more comprehensive lens on how to do this work. So let me start with just a definition of what I call tri-sector, just to be clear about it. I think a lot of you know our society and our economy is made up of 3 sectors: the private sector with companies, the nonprofit sector or the social sector with nonprofit entities, and then government, which has the public sector. So that could be city, county, state, district, or federal levels of government. And I like to say that we all go through a tri-sector day every day. So just for me, I woke up this morning in my house. It was built by private sector contractors. It's on private sector land. I took a shower this morning with public sector water that came from my local water district. I brushed my teeth with fair trade certified toothpaste. So that was my nonprofit piece. And then by the time I got to the kitchen, I had fair trade certified coffee. So I hadn't even gotten my day going before I was having a tri-sector day. And as you think about how you move through the day, you think about all the roads we travel on, the public transportation, the use of the internet, which we're on now, which was actually created by government, and how we interact with the social sector. And once you start paying attention to it, you realize that we live in a tri-sector world and there are resources everywhere around us all the time. When people ask me about New Impact and the work that we've chosen to do, because I've spent about 25 years in the private sector and now have shifted the last 5 years to the nonprofit world, I like to say that there are a lot of organizations that are focused on what and specific goals and specific opportunities for society. That's not what we do. We focus on the how. We think about ourselves as business model innovators, and we're very interested in the question of how we solve problems and how we find opportunities for organizations. And to shorthand it, we think a lot about this equation. We think that this trisector equation is key to how organizations can function. Private sector companies can have amazing assets, so can social sector organizations and government organizations. I like to point out that government has amazing databases. The social sector might have trusted relationship, and the private sector might have distribution systems. And we like to think about blending and combining the best resources from every sector to actually come up with the best model for whatever the opportunity we're trying to solve for is or problem we're trying to solve. So as you're going through the presentation, really think about this equation as the core of what we're trying to do. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background and framework. I'm going to give you a couple examples, talk about some tools and how we actually make this process happen, and then talk about opportunities for both the students on the call here and also community leaders. But let me start high level and talk about problems. Any of us can pull out society's problems, and they have a variety of commonalities to them. I will point out for this one that often these things are expensive, things like affordable housing or solving homelessness or food systems or even the health issues that we're facing now. And we also like to point out that everybody's on the team, right? Companies, nonprofits, and governments all play a role, but we don't do a particularly good job, in my opinion, at optimizing the capabilities that exist across the sectors. We have a framework for, we think, changing this and shifting how to think about this. And everything we do at New Impact hangs on these four boxes. The first thing is to think about repurposing the existing resources. If you think about the cost of all these new programs that can be quite expensive, well, when you think about the resources that have already been built in every company, all the resources already built by every government, and all the resources already built by every nonprofit, it's really extraordinary. And the balance sheet of Ohio and the balance sheet of the country is really, really quite big. So we focus a lot on repurposing the resources that are already out there as a way to fund a lot of this new work. We then think about ways to realign those resources in innovative ways. We look at ways to harness the aligned interests of the different groups to create common benefit. And when we do it right, we find solutions that make government more efficient, nonprofits more scalable, and companies more profitable, and greater impact for everybody. So that's the setup. I'd like to kind of share two examples of what these trisector models look like in real life, and then we'll talk about how to create a lot more of them. And the first example comes from my own background with Coinstar. Many people know about the coin counting machines. There's around 40,000 of them now throughout the US and Canada. And they're fairly common and fairly accepted. But what many people don't know is the why behind why I actually founded the company. And I was 26 when I started Coinstar, and I'd been really interested in a personal career when I got out of grad school in terms of not only working in the private sector, but also working in the social sector and working in the public sector. And the advice I'd gotten was to actually do those in sequence. So when I got out of school, maybe I should get a job for a company and learn some private sector skills. And then as I got older, maybe I could volunteer at a soup kitchen or serve on the board of a nonprofit. If I was lucky, become a philanthropist. And then after that, I could actually do public service. And then I'd like to say retire and die. So I kind of joke about this 5-part career path. But for whatever reasons, I was actually really interested in combining those careers into one and not doing them in a sequential way, but actually in parallel. So oddly enough, that led me to Coinstar, which isn't obvious on the surface, but I want to give you the background to it, which is obviously I had a jar of coins at home myself, so I had a personal problem as an entrepreneur. And I wrote to the Fed and I wrote to the Mint, and what I learned was they manufactured around $15 billion worth of physical coin stock to make the US economy work. And around half of that was actually out of circulation. So there was about $8 billion sitting on America's dresser tops. Which meant that $7 billion was actually being used every day to power cash transactions. I'd also taken a macroeconomics class at business school, so I'd learned about stocks and flows. And what I realized is the 7 billion that was circulating economy turned over 20 times a year and made a $150 billion market. So as a private sector entrepreneur, I thought, wow, $150 billion of coins flowing through the economy, that's a lot of coins. Potentially there's an opportunity to create a business where we could help people exchange those coins for cash. And in a sense, it was an untapped market that people hadn't seen before. But I also thought about my desire to work in the social sector, and I thought about the history of coins and charity. So if you think about things like March of Dimes or Salvation Army with their red buckets at the holidays, or UNICEF that used to collect coins at Halloween in their orange boxes. What I realized is if we had this successful network of machines that could count coins and convert them to cash for people, we could also collect donations and make it both a win for the company and a win for the recipient. And then I also thought about the government sector, and I realized that in studying the coin system, that if we were successful in building this company, we would actually have a huge impact on the nation's coin flow for the Fed and the Mint, and we would de facto create the nation's coin recycling system. And that's what happened. We created 40,000 of these machines. We raised 5 rounds of venture capital. We took the company public in 1997, and we kind of checked all the boxes on a private sector success story. But more importantly to me was we actually did implement the donation feature and raised over $100 million. We actually had UNICEF call us up and say, gee, can you actually use your machines to count all the coins that kids collect on Halloween? When we wired the machines up to actually take the donations in directly, and we cut our fee in half and directly wired the funds to UNICEF, which made it way more efficient for them. And in addition, we spent a lot of time with the Fed and the Mint. After we'd rolled out Los Angeles, I actually got a call from the Fed that said, who are you and what are you doing? The West Coast has canceled all future penny orders because they're being swamped with all these coins from your machines. So we had to fly to Washington, D.C. and explain ourselves, and they really fell in love with what we were doing because they realized that we could lower the cost of manufacturing new coins and the cost of distribution. So it was a fun story. I spent 10 years building that company. But what I learned from that experience is this equation, where you can actually create a business model where each sector both contributes to and benefits from the work that's out there. So one of the reasons Coinstar worked is it was a great private sector company, it was great for the social sector, and it was also great for government. And it actually having that tri-sector lens embedded in the business model itself made the core model stronger and actually embedded impact directly into what we do. We never had a CSR department at Coinstar because the entire company was CSR. Another way to think about that model is you can think about the resources in society, and I view societies having many, many siloed resources, company resources, nonprofit resources, and government resources that tend not to get mixed. But if you can be thoughtful about how to pick and choose the right resources in the sectors and then blend them with the right self-interest, you can actually create what I call these tri-sector models. And these can be done for for-profit companies, not-for-profit organizations, social enterprises, and governments. So the methodology works in all 3 sectors. I'd like to share one other case example, which is more relevant, I think, during today's time. This is a company I've been working with in New York now for the last 4 years. I used to call them an early stage startup company. They've now advanced to a little bit beyond. I call them mid-stage startup. But they play in the food stamp space. And this was a young group of entrepreneurs who wanted to do tech for good. And when I learned about them and they reached out to me, they said, hey, we are working with low-income people in the US who are disadvantaged, who are on the food stamp program or the SNAP program. And for those of you who don't know, the SNAP program is administered by the Department of Agriculture, and they essentially hand $70 billion of spending power to the states, and the states then manufacture a debit card which get handed out to people who need food assistance, those who are food insecure, and they load up about $200 a month on that card, and that's how food stamps works in the US. It's been especially important now during the time of COVID. And when I first met them, they realized that they had an opportunity to build an app to make the program work better for the end user, who we call Maria. And the basic problem that she was facing was she would run out of money. Those $200 that she got from the government every month only lasted her about 2 weeks. And she didn't know how much money was left on her card. So they created an app that tied into these big databases that actually let her see how much money she had left in her card so she wouldn't be embarrassed when she went to check out at the supermarket. And that was the basic premise of the company. Now, when I started working with them, I was really intrigued because it was such an interesting way to look at a government resource with a private sector lens. And it turns out they could not only do balance checking for Maria, but they actually got market transaction data for how she'd spent her money over the last 12 months, which is incredibly powerful because what the company's been able to do since then is can actually offer discounts and coupons to the end users and boost their spending power based upon the data. So right now, the average user can get maybe $50 a month of extra, and the target is to get them up to $100 a month. So instead of the $200 from the government, they can actually extend that spending power to be much, much greater. So that's a great service for her and very powerful. But with the new impact in the tri-sector lens, we said, can we do more? Are there other resources that would be important to her that can be found in government or found in the social sector? So just a couple of examples, it turns out that there's a very powerful resource in government, which is that if Maria wants to shop at a farmer's market, she can actually get twice the value for spending power if she buys fresh vegetables. So if she shows up at the local farmer's market in Akron and Kent and has her card, she can get $40 worth of value for $20 worth of the debit. And the reason for that is there's a federal program that actually doubles the value of food stamp benefits, which is implemented through cities nationwide. So it's a very powerful resource that's available to her, also a very underutilized program that's out there. And there are many other resources in government that Maria needs. There are also social sector resources she needs that can be provided by nonprofits, things like job training or childcare or assistance with heating. And the point of this is that if you think about it from the end user standpoint, Maria has a tri-sector day. And what Propel has done is it's created a very compelling app that provides her tri-sector resources that make her day flow much, much more easily. It's also turned out to be a very smart way for Propel to build its business. It launched as a private sector company. When I was first involved, I think it raised $3 or $4 million. It's done a second round. It's attracted some of the best investors in the country, including Kleiner Perkins and Andreessen Horowitz, and it recently disclosed another round, and it's now worth over $100 million. I think this program will grow to serving probably 10 to 15 million people throughout the US, and I think this will be the biggest change to a social safety net program in US government history. It's really quite powerful. And we've actually been talking to the Office of Management and Budget about 26 other opportunities inside of the federal government where we can improve the touch points for end users. The power here really for Propel in making this work is because they use the tri-sector lens. They've since expanded the offering to shopping lists and a bunch of other things you can see here. And it's been really exciting to see them grow. Now, in the last 4 years, we've worked with many other types of organizations with this tri-sector approach. Other startups, Fortune 1000s, Fortune 100 companies, nonprofits, governments, you can see the list here. And we have lots of use cases for private sector model really across the sectors. What I'm excited about for all of you here in Ohio is I think there's a large opportunity for you regionally. If you step back and you think about every company within 200 miles of where you are now, every nonprofit and every government entity, there are thousands of programs and goods and services embedded in your region in all three sectors. The question I would ask you to think about, is there a way to harness the opportunities about repurposing and realigning the assets you already have in your region? And we can do that by helping you gain some of the insight by asking what we call our three questions. And I'd ask you to play a little game with me. Imagine you're a private sector company. If you actually work for a company, this can be your company. If you're a student, you've worked for a company, be that company for the moment. And if I were to show up and talk with you about tri-sector innovation, the very first thing I'd ask you about is, what is your private sector strategy? And since many of you have been to business school, you would have a good answer for what that strategy is. But then I'd ask you, what's your social sector strategy? I'd ask you, how do you work with nonprofits and social sector enterprises? And I don't mean donations, and I don't mean CSR. I'd be wanting to know how to use your core business assets in a way that is mission aligned with the core business model of that social sector entity. And what are the social sectors, what are the social sector's core assets that could actually be good for your business model? These are questions that most companies understand, and some are actually doing them, but there's much greater opportunity to pursue this. The last question I'd ask you is, what's your public sector strategy? How do you work with government? And I often get met with answers here saying, we don't like working with government. Government slows us down and they get in our way. And I have to ask companies to think a little more deeply because I can say, are there any assets in a government that could be useful to you? And I'm often met by blank stares. So I have to remind people that I founded a $1 billion company in Coinstar by finding a $150 billion market in my pocket full of pennies that was created by government. Propel has found a very compelling private sector opportunity by finding databases in an old Department of Agriculture social safety net program. And I would submit there are very powerful assets that can be utilized in a collaborative way amongst the sectors. Now, these three questions are great to ask if you're a private sector company, but you can also ask them if you run a social enterprise or a nonprofit. I would ask you, what's your private sector strategy? How are you working with companies beyond just raising money from them, and how are you working with governments? And if you work at a city or a county or a state or a federal agency, I'd ask you, what's your private sector strategy beyond taxation and regulation, and what's your social sector strategy? We find these framing questions to be really powerful to get people to start to shift their mindset. Because fundamentally, what we do at New Impact is two things. We want people to think about their organizations with this tri-sector lens, because we have found it so powerful and so compelling. And then once they see the mindset and the opportunity, we want to give them very practical tools to actually get these strategies implementation. Our focus is all about igniting impact and embedding impact into the core model. And we have four components of the work we do. One is to inspire people to think this way, part of which is talks like this. The second is to identify the resources and the assets. The third is to actually drive real innovation that's highly pragmatic. And the fourth thing is actually getting these things into the field and launched and actually delivering good for people. So we have a process and tools. I'm not going to go through this deeply in this talk tonight. There is going to be a follow-on talk, I believe, on November 10th. And I'll be diving in much more deeply into the tools for those of you who are interested. And there'll be follow-on workshops, and all this will actually lead to the class. For those of you students who are interested in this, if you want to learn this process and these tools and make real-world change happen, this is the type of work you will be doing. So kind of view the talk tonight as kind of setting the table for where we're going. So under each of these headings, we have a series of actions we do and a series of tools under inspiration, under identify, under innovate, and under invest. And all of those tools and actions actually help us solve that equation at the bottom of the page. What I'd like to do is kind of highlight some of the tools. And we've built all these tools ourselves over the last 3 years. They're all open data. We intend to make them open source. New Impact operates as a public good, so they're free and available to anybody. And the tools we built are really designed to help answer questions that we find are fundamental to driving these tri-sector strategies. So the first set of questions we ask in a new situation after asking about the three strategy questions are, where are there opportunities for impacting your region, and what does the community need or want? And for that, we use tools like that we call expert spotlighting and community insights. We then ask a set of questions about where to focus first, because invariably you get hundreds of ideas out of that first questions. And we ask, are there bottlenecks or unmet needs? And we use a tool we call impact journeys to bring that to life. Thirdly, where we get really interested in the resources, who has what? So we ask this question of who's on the team and what resources do they have that can be leveraged or repurposed, which can often help either new companies launch much more quickly, or existing companies find resources that they don't have to finance themselves. And then lastly, we look for aligned interests and ways to actually strengthen the business model to generate not only stronger results for the organization, whether that's for-profit, for a for-profit entity, or whether that's for benefit if it's a social sector entity, or for public good if it's a government entity, and greater impact. And for that, we use tools like the innovation canvas and the tri-sector equation. So I'm going to give you a little appetizer on each of these as we go through. So first on these questions for the expert spotlighting community insights. Expert spotlighting is really a tool that we've developed based on interviewing experts in the area, but we do it with a tri-sector lens. And it takes a lot of time and effort to go through, but the idea is to leverage the existing knowledge base that exists in a region. There are many people that spend a lifetime in their career with deep understandings. And what we really want to do is surface their best ideas around bottlenecks or barriers or opportunities and be able to share those in a public and collaborative way. For instance, this summer with the University of Washington, the Seattle Foundation, we had 4 teams of interns who were focused on a variety of efforts, primarily focused around food systems, racial inequities, and mental health. And they conducted over 137 interviews, categorized them, and actually tagged and submitted in a very public way the key insights that each of these experts have. And I'd suggest that this same sort of work can be done in Ohio to really understand what are the nuances that are out there. It also suggests there's a lot of commonalities between the work that we've done here in Seattle and the work that we've done in Ohio. The second tool we think is equally important, which is the experts can have lots of knowledge, and we're going to make sure that's at the table. But the voice of the community is equally important and potentially even more important in these days. And there are many ways to get community input, but we've started to assemble a stream of public data sets from social media, public sector data, community comments, and we're taking all of these commentary from the public in, and we're starting to use AI and machine learning to analyze them, tag them, use sentiment analysis and whatnot to see what's happening. In the example that you can see up here, which is being prototyped now, we're actually looking at what's the reaction to masks and what's on the mind with people's masks in the country with COVID. These are the sort of insights that we'll also get. They also get fed in the community insights tool. So these are all real comments from real people that we can then tag in terms of is a positive or negative sentiment, is it an idea, is it a suggestion. And these also feed the public database. So those 2 tools we think are really important to start to identify the areas for impact and understanding what the community wants and needs. That then leads us to the second part of our process, which is that will generate hundreds of ideas. The question becomes where to focus and where are there bottlenecks or unmet needs. And for that, we use a tool called impact journeys. And impact journeys are very similar to what I introduced up front with this tri-sector lens and the tri-sector day. And essentially with an impact journey, we think about the person or the consumer or the impacted person, and we walk through their day with a tri-sector lens to see what happens and how they interact with the different sectors, and we map it out in great detail. So what's shown in graphic form here on the left-hand side is an impact journey for something we call the road to homelessness. And there are many, many steps along the road to homelessness, but as we were working with a graduate student team, we chose to focus on the eviction moment, because it turns out people often get evicted because they're missing rent for a couple of months. And we started to brainstorm ideas for insurance company to provide short-term rental insurance, which could stem that flood of eviction and save a lot of downstream costs. We also focused a lot on vehicle homelessness. It turns out about half the people who are homeless actually live in cars. And by using the impact journey, we were able to highlight some policy changes that were important. Now, these impact journeys are one of our best tools. They take a while to build. This is a real example of the impact journey that the team in Cleveland built for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'm not going to take you through it, but I'll just show you here's what it's like to go visit the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And here's where you interact with people along the way, including driving on public sector roads and using the internet. And those red areas are bottlenecks. And those are often the areas that we'll choose to focus on to try to decide, gee, this might be the area to focus on to actually drive innovation that we can actually do something with, because trying to solve the whole problem at once is just far too complex. So that impact journey tool is one of our favorites, and again, it answers these sorts of questions. We then move on to this question of resources, and we ask the question about who's on the team and what resources can be leveraged to repurpose. And for that, we use a tool we call the New Impact Wiki. And the wiki, not surprisingly, looks a lot like Wikipedia. It has that same sort of feel. And it's essentially a directory of organizations that it's online, and it organizes their resources by geography and importantly by impact area. We've already started in Ohio. We recently have loaded roughly the 70,000 501c3s that operate in the state of Ohio. Some of them have already started to be mapped. We would love to talk to Kent State about ways to go more deeply in the counties around you to get those resources up and available. We've also started mapping out private sector companies and importantly, government companies. And when you look through the wiki, there's a variety of information. But the key thing we like to do is to highlight what resources are out there. And you can think about these as ingredients for a tri-sector model. You know, for instance, maybe you needed farmland. Well, who has the farmland? Or maybe you needed a delivery network. You could go see who has the delivery network. We also highlight the databases. We believe here in the 21st century that the power of data is fundamental. It is the oil of the 21st century. So we're actually creating an online map of data sets organized by impact area. Now, I mentioned impact areas. To organize all this information, we need frameworks to try to say, what are they worked on? What are they for? So some of you may be familiar with the SDGs and the global goals. There are 17 of these that have been agreed on for the world. Many countries are implementing this, and in the U.S., many universities are implementing this. I know both Kent State and Case Western are doing this. And basically, with the wiki, you can actually click through any of these tiles. So you could click through on, goal 2 on zero hunger, and target 2.1 ending hunger, and you could see who is on the team in terms of who has resources, what companies have resources that could be used for hunger, what nonprofits, and what government entities. So it's a very powerful way to find information and to find often unexpected resources in places that you wouldn't expect to find them. We can also organize all this information by local goals. So Cleveland Rising has been creating a series of anywhere between 20 to 30 goals for Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. The same information can be categorized in the same way. So if you wanted to know who is on the team for transportation in Northeast Ohio, you could click through on goal 10 and you could see a list of players in all 3 sectors. Each player has an individual page. This is a mock-up of where the data is heading. This is an example for General Motors and what tags they're on. Here's an example of Star Vista, which is a very large nonprofit organization. Here's an example for the city of San Jose. We'd love to have Akron and Kent and Cleveland, which we've already started on in here as well. And then we have federal resources as well. So that's a tour through the wiki. And again, fundamentally, it's answering these questions about team and resources that can be blended together in a tri-sector model. And then lastly, we ask the question around where are their aligned interests? Because to get these models to work, people have to show up and be willing to work together. And I want to emphasize, these aren't traditional public-private partnerships. These are very specific, very actionable business models where resources flow in effect because the interests have been aligned to strengthen each party's needs. Remember, each sector both contributes to and benefits from. And we use a couple of tools here. For those of you who are familiar with a startup canvas or lean startup canvas, this has been modified for what we call a tri-sector startup canvas or innovation dashboard. It brings the tools together. You'll see the community insights tools, the expert spotlighting, the impact journey. You'll see the private sector team members, resources, and self-interests. It takes a lot of work to actually put this together, and students, when you're going through the process, this will be one of the outputs you come to actually help create a business model for the organization that you work with. In addition to that, that can be simplified down into solving the equation. In the beginning, I showed the equation as a bubble. Here's an example of an equation that's actually been filled out. This particular example was done for a new idea called TechCore, which is working on solving the digital access issues with everybody being online right now and looking at the existing players who have resources that can help this come together. So this is the output of about 10 weeks of work that's put together. It's very exciting. This particular project is actually has gotten funded and is now standing up in the Seattle area. So locally, we've actually applied these tools in this process. And I mentioned Cleveland Rising and the creation of something called the Proof Team, who got very interested in tri-sector strategies. And to launch this work in Ohio, they selected the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as the first organization to work with, to think about, are there ways for the Rock Hall to improve its own business model and to improve its own impact by using tri-sector strategies. And the team used all the tools in the process that is highlighted and generated many, many different ideas. And they did it last spring in the process of COVID. And I'm not going to go through all the things, but just to give you a sense of the type of things that they were talking about, we have recommended to Rock Hall that they actually look at ways to leverage their virtual assets. One of the big challenges for Rock Hall right now is obviously with COVID, the museum was closed for a long time. Half of their users came from internationally or from a long ways away, so they needed a way to reach people who are much further than 6 hours. They also had a challenge with people who were local not driving. And so we thought through, is there a tri-sector set of resources that could be compelling that people would actually pay for to leverage the Rock Hall resources? As part of that work, we also got really interested in the power of rock and roll and the power of music. And we made some recommendations to Rock and Roll Hall of Fame around the power of what they have for improving mental health and improving education. I'm personally really interested in the mental health piece because I think as COVID persists, the taxation on all of us in different forms of mental health, I actually think might be greater than the impacts of COVID itself. And I think the power of music and what the Rock Hall has might be a key strategic asset for improving mental health. Catalyst projects are a lot of the way that our work manifests. These are just some examples of work that we've done over the summer with grad students at the University of Washington. I already mentioned the Tech Core project, which came out of the digital literacy work. We also did an initiative around restaurants being more of community hubs and creating stronger business models for restaurants as they struggle with COVID and the shutdowns. We looked at an app from Open Minds about leveraging mental health resources, and we also looked at some civic engagement and voting patterns using those tools as well. So I hope those 4 tools and those questions, or so that set of questions and those tools gives you a sense about how we can actually transform either existing organizations or new organizations and make them stronger with a tri-sector lens. We basically work through these four components of our process and use the tools that I've described, and that combination helps us solve the equation. So I think in closing, I think the opportunity that's in front of all of you in Ohio is I think the stage has been set for what I would say creating a tri-sector innovation ecosystem. The idea that Kent State is going to be teaching this, that you have volunteers who are excited, that you have organizations who have already done this, I think creates a really powerful opportunity. I think this is an opportunity for you to start to engage companies with a different conversation and show companies a way that they can not only profit and grow, but embed impact into their core models. I think this is a way to engage nonprofits and governments with a new mindset and also change how their models work. Right now, we've done work with one organization. Through the work of this course, we hope to work with 5 to 10 other organizations this spring in the class. But we think over the coming year that can transfer into hundreds of organizations, if not thousands of organizations over the coming years. And I'd ask you to imagine in Ohio where you had thousands of organizations across all 3 sectors who were thinking deeply about how they embedded the resources and the benefits of the other sectors in their core models. Lastly, I won't go through all these points here, but the idea of learning at Kent State how to do this tri-sector analysis and how to drive business model, I think is really powerful. My hope is that this course is really successful and that Kent State embeds this in its curriculum going forward. So over the coming years, it can produce thousands of graduates who know how to do this work and can actually bring it to life, whether they work for a company, a nonprofit, or a government. The next steps for those of you on the call are these. So for students, you can register for the spring class. You can see the information that's up there and the numbers for the courses. For community leaders, you can think about this as a kickoff for tri-sector innovation in Ohio. We already have the first Catalyst project underway, and I encourage you to think about your own organization. If you work for a company, if you work for a government or a nonprofit, how can you make it stronger? It might be a small knob adjustment, it could be a large knob adjustment. And I encourage you to think about working with Kent State and the students who will be looking for projects and areas to actually work so we can actually launch Catalyst projects. We're planning a follow-up presentation on November 10th. We'll go much more deeply into the tools and the process, and there'll also be some workshops that are in development in November and December before the class kicks off in January. So I'd like to close by urging you all to become what I call tri-sector innovators. It's a different way of thinking about your organization, and it's a slightly different way about assembling these tools. But I can promise you that once you adopt this approach and the way you start to think about it, it stays with you and you won't see the world the same way. Thank you very much.